Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And you recognize this wonderful gentleman with us. It's Ganesh. How are you, Ganesh?
I'm fantastic, and it's exciting to be with you tonight.
We have a major time difference between us because Landon and I are, of course, in Mountain Time. What is even the time zone that you're in, Ganesh, on the other side of the world?
That's a very good question. I'm not entirely sure. I'm in Dubai at the moment, which is about 10 hours ahead of you guys, and the next day. So I'm coming to you from the future again, but not quite as far as New Zealand. So there's that.
We love that because it makes Mormonish seem, international, right, Landon? We
That's
just have guests from all over the world. Actually, we just like strong arm people until we're like, please come on. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Even when I'm on vacation, I'm going to come on, which is great.
Well, we can't wait for Ganesh to go home because he never goes home. So
he's been out and about for like 10 years, I think. No, we love it when Ganesh travels.
I might be in exile. Who knows? Maybe I'll never get back.
Could happen. You could be wandering around, sharing your travels and adventures, like I don't know, Paddington Bear, maybe. Who knows? So,
yes.
Well, you may have noticed how Landon is dressed tonight. This is not how Landon typically dresses, is it, Landon?
Just when I don't want to comb my hair.
There is that. You just kind of throw a hat on. So, no, our topic tonight is kind of interesting. And of course, we're putting this out in October. It's kind of got a little scary bent to it, right? For Halloween season, we're going to be talking about the fate of the members of the mob what are you drinking, Land?
That's some liquid courage to go get Joe.
That's it. The Carthage Jail mob. And the reason Landon is dressed like this is because this is how the members of the mob are always portrayed, aren't they, Ganesh? Like talking like this, and the alcohol and the swarthy look. They're always portrayed like that. And that is not exactly the case. Have you seen that before, Ganesh, in like movies and films of the martyrdom?
Oh, yes. We always make the villains those hard, dark, disgusting, dirty, ruffians, because, of course, if we can make them less like us, then we can make that, distinction between them as the bad guys, the evil people that are doing these terrible things.
Yep.
And, of course,
exactly right.
we can then, and then it's not, us enacting our will on them. It's revenge or vengeance, or it's just being right.
Mm-hmm. No, that's exactly right. It's black and white. It's archetypal villains and it's good guys, and that's how we were all raised. That's how it was in the primary stories. The mob came after them. You never stop to ask yourself, who was this mob and why exactly were they after them? It's not till you get older and you start to realize the nuance of the entire situation. And as I came to realize, I think back in the day, I might have been the mob. You know what? Just somebody that was concerned about this element that had moved into communities, taking over politically and with a very different moral code than everyone else. So yeah, that was kind of realization that hit me once. I'm like, I think I might have been the mob. I might have been trying to protect my family and, circle of friends and society from this group of what I probably would have seen as interlopers. So that's kind of a realization. But we're going to talk about this today because it's a great topic. It has some humor to it, believe it or not. And I think we're going to learn something new. So we have, of course, a fabulous slideshow. I'm the mom
that's got to wear glasses in order to see anything. So
which way was Carthage? Yeah, we're trying not to make light. No, not at all. But that is kind of funny with your glasses. I love it. So okay, so, and this slideshow involves a field trip that Landon and I took. So stay tuned. We're going to talk about that later. So I'm calling this Poor Old Brooks and Other Wretched Tales of the Martyrdom. Because believe it or not, in Mormon lore, we know what happened to a lot of these men that participated in the martyrdom. And it's pretty shocking. And I guess from the perspective of the LDS, well-deserved. So we're going to dig into some of these stories and see, is this truth or is it more of a tall tale? I don't know, but I love this picture. It's by Hieronymus Bosch, if I remember my art history degree. It's been a while, but this is hell, basically. Look at all those characters and creatures there. So had to throw that in there. All right, let's continue. Okay, so of course we're starting with the event, June 27th, 1844. Joseph and Hyrum Smith are killed at Carthage Jail. There's a picture of Joseph and Hyrum, picture representational. And there's a picture of Joseph falling out of the window on the left there. So I think everybody is familiar with this foundational event in Mormon history where Joseph Smith sealed his testimony with his blood. In fact, I think a lot of us have thought, what would it be like if that hadn't have happened? I think the church might be really different, if maybe not even existing at all at that point. I don't know. It's interesting to think about.
And it's interesting to think that this, these kind of ideas of martyrdom stories, they capture people. The idea that that you are the underdog, the persecuted, and of course there's a visitor center at Carthage Jail. You can go, you can visit, you can see and feel and be incensed at the wrong that was done to these men on the actual site. It's really I wouldn't say it's a fun experience. It's not supposed to be. It's more like cementing that in your collective memory that this is the moment.
Yeah, like a pilgrimage kind of. Were you just there this summer? I know you were back at all the different sites. Did you visit Carthage this summer?
Not this summer, no. But I have been there, and it's it's a great place to go. It's the church really sets the scene for you to feel very connected emotionally to this event. But of course, this is pivotal in Mormon history and all of the things we do, including one of our Doctrine and Covenants sections. So it's cemented in our minds as the moment.
Yep. No, I'm sure that's true. And you've been there, Landon. I have not been there, but you've been there. And I'm guessing a lot of our viewers and listeners can probably mention in the chat what the feeling is. I had heard that they will point to something and say there's a blood stain on the floor, or like look at the bullet holes. When you went, Landon, was that your experience? Did they there's amp it up?
Holes in the door, and there was definitely like a stain on the floor that had stained through. But the grounds are pristine. They don't look anything like they probably did at the time of the massacre. They've got gardens, and they make it look like a quaint little jail rather than the probably more frontier jail that it was at the time.
Yeah, I remember a post that I saw. It was a collection of pictures just from social media of Mormon families visiting Carthage. And it was so funny because they're all standing there just smiling like you would with the Disney princesses. And somebody just kind of said, what is the appropriate look or reaction at Carthage? You just had these mom, dads, kids all going, we're here. So it is kind of interesting because it is kind of like a touristy, area in a foundational event. But, do you smile? Do you not smile? I don't know. So this is what happened. Martyrdom. Here it is, June 27th, 1844. Let's go to our next slide. And this is a question. Who was the mob? What does this say, Ganesh? Can you read this for us?
When we speak of the mob that killed Joseph and Hyrum Smith in Carthage Jail, we sometimes forget that each of these men had names and lives. Of the approximately 100 men involved in the attack that killed Joseph and Hyrum, only 9 were indicted. 4 immediately fled. Only 5 men were brought to trial.
I didn't realize that. Did you realize that? I guess I never really thought it through. The Joseph Smith Papers Project, which has all things Joseph Smith, has a really good analysis of all of these things. If you want to dive into the background and what happened and why and who and when, it's surprising the kind of details that are available, but also that you just don't even think about, as a member, because we're just told about this horrific story. We're not actually told that there was a lot of wrangling to get this done. There was I'm sure we'll talk about them as I go. No, you're absolutely right. We just keep hearing that 3-letter word mob. It was the mob. And we don't think any further. We never think past that until maybe we're thinking about everything else, shelves are breaking, and you revisit that event in your mind and you say, I wonder what happened. I wonder how that was different, because there are so many other events that you, when your shelf breaks, look at and go, oh, let's find out what really happened. But I never thought to learn the names of the people that were involved. If anybody went to trial, did you ever think in those terms, Landon, or was it just how you're dressed, the mob?
No, it was always the mob. It's always this, no face put on it. It's just the mob, and they're, they're there to prove that the church is true by just opposing it. By the mere fact that they're opposed to it, that means the church is true. Never do you ever hear anything about, the polygamy that Joseph was practicing at the time, the counterfeiting, the bank scandals, all the things that he was doing in the community that would upset any citizen, regardless of whether their belief or not. When you bring a large group of people of one denomination that vote as a block into a frontier area and take over the town through your politics and through your the power that you have, you're going to upset people. And much of the mob had more to do with the politics than the religion. And that's something that's never mentioned. Just read Kingdom of Nauvoo, and you'll understand why there might be a mob or a rising against them. The other thing that you never hear about in this particular incident, the jail, is that, and you'll see right here in this picture the same thing. They never show that Joseph had a gun, that they were armed,
to the slaughter.
that they had weapons as well inside. So it wasn't quite as a defenseless. Granted, they were highly outgunned, but they did have guns, which demonstrates, how are they getting guns inside of a jail when they're supposed to be locked in? So.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance to it.
And the other thing is, you don't know why Joseph is there, right? You don't know that he's actually being held for treason, as you kind of alluded, Landon. These are significant charges that he is brought up on. And the reason he's in the jail is because he's held for treason, he can't get bail. And so everybody else who's come to Carthage to account for what's just happened in Nauvoo, they all get bail and get to go back to Nauvoo, but Hyrum and Joseph are held on treason charges, so they have to stay there in Carthage. So there's lots of these little things that you just don't know till you to investigate.
And it's not the first time he's been held on treason charges. He was in Liberty Jail as well for treason on treason charges. So
yeah, these are things you don't learn in primary. There is a coloring page showing treason, right? That does not happen. So, all right, let's find out what happens next. Okay, so I thought it would be interesting. Like they said, there were only 5 that were finally held over for trial. Others fled. 100 people involved, but there were these 5 that went to trial. So I thought it'd be interesting just to read very briefly who these men who actually ended up in court in front of a judge, who they were. So I'll read the first one. This man's name was Mark Aldrich. He was a land developer and commander of the Warsaw Independent Battalion, a 2-company battalion attached to the 59th Regiment. And when he was indicted, he was 42 years old. So a military commander of sorts and somebody who developed land in the area. So that doesn't sound like somebody that Landon's dressed like, right? Someone on the street corner with this bottle and just right away you're like, wait, what? A military officer and a land developer? He was in the mob? Right away you start wondering what's happening.
Well, he sounds very much like Joseph Smith. Wasn't that what Joseph Smith was? Yeah. Was a land developer and commander of the Nauvoo Legion?
Well, self-appointed. Yes, I have a feeling this gentleman probably had some weight behind his position.
Behind his
the United
credentials.
States government. Yeah, a credential. So, okay, so here's the first one. And some of these I found real pictures. Some I just used AI. This one's a real picture, though. That's really him. Let's see. Who's this, Landon?
This is Thomas C. Sharp, publisher of the Warsaw Signal, a leading anti-Mormon newspaper. His age at indictment was 31. So anyone who knows church history knows the Warsaw Signal was a pain in Joseph's behind all the time. And I think Thomas Sharp was probably involved with this. Not only had he written a lot of things against what was happening in Nauvoo and against Joseph Smith's leadership there, but they just burned a newspaper, which to a man of the press in this nation, burning it down, the first edition of the Nauvoo Expositor must have must have really wrangled some. But he's a publisher. He's a newspaper man.
Mm-hmm. And I like how they say anti-Mormon newspaper. Of course, that's sort of a spin on it because, in his mind and a lot of people's mind, he is just publishing the news of the day about Mormons and, historical facts. So that's kind of interesting. And only 31. Okay.
And also people were relying on that, right? The
Yes.
newspapers were a big part of how people communicated information to what were, they didn't have, that was the news of the day, that you got your paper, you read it, everybody was reading the paper. So of course this was problematic, but also it meant that people had to be pretty upfront about where they, what they believed and what they were thinking and how it played out, because it was being scrutinized in the moment by the people around them. So there was some checks and balances to that.
I think that's absolutely true. You don't mess with the newspaper. I mean, it's civilization. It is the check and balance. And here comes, the Mormons, Joseph Smith, and that's like anarchy, right? Destroying the press. I mean, think about how we would feel today. The press is manipulated, but to flat out. And we've seen this before in other countries. I don't think so much in the US, but bombing newspaper offices, things like that. People take that extremely personally because it means something. Freedom of the press is extremely important. So, okay, who's this person, Ganesh?
Levi Williams, who was a colonel and commanding officer of the 59th Regiment of the Illinois Militia. He at age of indictment, he was 34.
And he was 34. And this is an AI picture. This is not him, but it looks like it could be, right? He looks intense. So a military officer, right? A lot of these people are people that are in the, and he was a colonel.
And they had command, right? Like, so these people weren't just, they were important people in their community, and they were leaders. They were people who people trusted.
Yeah, no, that's kind of right out of the gate, the point that we're trying to make. These are not the people that are, what Landon's kind of trying to portray sort of facetiously. Look at this one, Jacob C. Davis, a state senator and commander of the Warsaw Cadets, and he was 31 at the age of indictment. So you're right. These are what might be considered the leaders of the community, the people with positions of some kind of influence. These are not what we were told when we learned the mob. So who's our last one, Landon?
The last one's William N. Grover, captain of the Warsaw Rifle Company. He was age 26.
And he was 26. So, yeah. And these are the ones that were indicted. We'll talk later about ones that were involved that were even more high up politically, had even more influence. I was extremely surprised because I've always heard the other narrative. So anyway, these were the 5 gentlemen. You could read up about each of them. They have their own stories, but this kind of gives you in a nutshell, who each of these gentlemen that finally actually went to trial of all the people involved. So let's go to our next slide and find out what did happen at that trial. You want to read this, Landon?
Yeah, the 5 men indicted for the murders of Joseph and Hyrum Smith were acquitted at trial in May 1845. Prosecutor Josiah Lamborn conceded that he didn't have enough evidence to convict 2 of the defendants, Davis and Grover. Jury acquitted all 5 defendants after 2 hours of deliberation.
Oh my goodness, Ganesh, how do you think the Latter-day Saint population felt about that?
They felt betrayed, but it matched their expectation actually, because they felt like this was a set jury already, that they weren't going to have a fair trial, and also that maybe if the outcome was different, that they would face more persecution. So they were slightly resigned to the idea that these people would get off, and they were also, kind of, they also were worried that a negative outcome might impact them negatively. So, yeah, they'd wiped their hands of it already.
Yeah. I think they were ready just to move on. Half of them were going to go west, half of them were going to, morph into something else and, join other churches or follow Emma or follow Sydney or follow Strang. So yeah, I think they were just ready. That was done. It was over.
I think you need to look at this from a larger picture though, because, would Joseph and Hyrum get a fair trial, outside of Nauvoo? No. Would they get a fair trial inside of Nauvoo? Absolutely not. They would be acquitted if the trial was held in Nauvoo, just as much as these men were acquitted for it being outside of Nauvoo. You also have to look at this. These are military men. Most of these guys that were being tried for this. How dangerous were the Mormons to these guys? How much of a threat were they? Even with Joseph gone, you got to remember that the Nauvoo Legion was almost as large as the United States Army at the time. So even though these were militia commanders, they were far outnumbered by the Nauvoo Legion had the Nauvoo Legion decided to march on in any of these cities. So this is more than just a man being tried for murder. This was treason of a man who commanded a large army, literally just miles away from where these people lived. So when you put it into that perspective, obviously the jurors are going to be saying, well, we're not going to convict our own officers who are here defending us against that large Mormon Nauvoo Legion that's just a few miles away from us. So when you start putting it into perspective, one of the things we just had a recent episode about Joseph Smith and does the church have a Joseph Smith problem? And one of the things that came up over and over again was, well, Joseph was a product of his time. We can't judge him on today's standards. Well, if that's the way we're going to do it, then you also have to judge the mob by the same standard. And that standard is frontier justice. You didn't have a good court system. You didn't have prosecutors and you didn't have a strong central government that would make sure that it was fair. This was conducted when people came in and broke the societal norms. It was the community leaders that would lead the justice to throw those people out. And that's what was expected. And that's why you see so many of these men are leaders in the community, because that's their role, is to step up and rid the community of what they see as a threat.
Wow, that is such a good point. And you're right. The Mormons, whether we want to hear it or not, did break many of the societal norms and were seen as predatory in lots of ways, politically dominant, manipulating everything. So you're absolutely right. Thanks for sharing that big picture, because that's very true.
I think it's worth knowing, though, that this was a highly charged, trial, and lots of people were watching it all over the United States. And so there was quite a lot done to try and make sure that it was going to be robust. And the reason that these people stormed the jail in the first place and killed Joseph Smith was because actually a year prior, Joseph had been extradited to Missouri and had been arrested, and he managed to get to Nauvoo and be acquitted by habeas corpus, which meant that the people around the area had no faith that Joseph and Hyrum would be convicted of treason. If they, even outside of Nauvoo, because they had managed to get out of a number of really problematic, law indictments earlier. And so while, yes, I agree that there was a huge amount of political pressure with lots of ways that these people might have, got out of this conviction, there was also a lot on the other side, riding, the idea of a law of justice. What happened kind of was a little bit of an anomaly for Illinois, in that they had prided themselves with a really strong judicial legal system, and they felt like it had failed them when it came to holding Joseph, particularly Joseph, accountable for his actions. And so they took matters into their own hands as vigilantes. And then, of course, the members felt like the judicial system favored the persecutors in this particular trial. But actually underneath that, there's a whole lot of people trying to work to shore up the the judges and you can actually go and read all of the transcripts of the trial on the Joseph Smith Papers Project.
Oh, wow.
So you can see that like there's some stuff there, but actually there's a lot of back and forth between the prosecutor and the defendants. There's a lot of putting forth evidence and then it being challenged and taken down. So actually, as much as we think, because we want it to be a one-sided one way or one-sided the other, actually there's a lot going on behind the scenes that suggests that people are actually getting fairly decent legal representation. And one reason I would suggest that this is even the case in Missouri is that Joseph Smith, they tried to extradite him and he managed to get off, but they actually captured his bodyguard, right? Walter Rockwell. And they took him to Missouri for trial and they held him for a couple of years while they went through a judicial process with him. But eventually they went through a trial with him and they determined that there wasn't enough evidence and they let him go. Missouri let Porter Rockwell go when he went through the court system. And he was gone a long time and the conditions were terrible and it was a horrific experience, but he actually went through the process, and at the end they decided that they didn't have enough evidence to convict him on the assassination of Governor Boggs, and they let him go and he returned back to Nauvoo. Now, would that have happened if Joseph had been extradited to Missouri? It's hard to tell. Maybe a mob might have stormed the jail there and killed him, but these were the kinds of things that were going on in the background that made people feel like these people in Nauvoo were getting away with murder.
Mm-hmm.
And
literally.
And unless we do something ourselves, it's just it's not going to be pretty for our state. And it's
such a complex situation, and I love that you're bringing up the Joseph Smith Papers, because now more than ever anyone can dive in and do research on this and find out what really happened. I love those Joseph Smith Papers. I have to say, just every day you hear something new that's come out. So, all right, let's move forward. Anyway, everybody acquitted. There we go. Everybody's gone. So the curse of the martyrdom. Here we go. This is where it starts to get scary and Halloweeny. So it says, while a prisoner in jail at Liberty, Missouri, March 20th of 1839, Joseph Smith wrote that God had assured him that cursed are all those that shall lift up the heel against mine anointed. He's always writing scriptures about himself. I love it. Such curses are common in folk literature, and according to these popular stories, Joseph's curse, or his reporting of the curse, had flesh and blood implications. So he basically said, if anybody goes against me, there's going to be some kind of divine retribution. Had you, Landon, heard about a curse or anything that Joseph had put on everybody? I guess you probably are familiar with this scripture.
I wasn't really aware that there was a curse put on him, but I certainly can see, I wouldn't think of this as a curse like a voodoo doll or something, that you're cursed and all these things are going to happen to you. Certainly, the Lord always was telling Joseph that you're my divinely, you're my special one. Anyone who comes against you, I'll defend you against them. So that doesn't surprise me, but I can certainly see where that became the impetus for these wild stories that we're going to discuss here a little bit later.
Well, and think about it. Don't you think, Ganesh, with seeped in the magical worldview and the magical overtones, of course a curse makes sense, right? Or to write something like that from the religious point of view, as he wrote.
And curses are so much fun. Yeah. And think of those early missionaries dusting their feet off. Exactly. The idea that God is going to make right what your own personal vendetta. I think that's I want one of those.
Yeah, we all do. Well, and I think that just it's par for the course. You always hear, well, they may not get theirs in this life, but in the next life, right?
Yeah.
Everybody knows in the next life, everybody that's ever wronged you is going to get theirs. And even when I was a kid, I thought, but wait, doesn't that mean that we're going to have to forgive them though in the next life? Isn't that part of getting to the next life? And, we're going to have to forgive them, whether they get theirs or not. So, but that sense of divine retribution, that's baked into religion because life is not fair. So you have to have something where you feel like God will take care of it. Give it to God. He'll take care of it. And that's the origin of a lot of these stories we're going to read, which are just crazy. So, all right, let's go forward. Did you know this, Ganesh? Read that. Had you heard this before? Read this.
Brigham Young is rumored to have cursed the mob too.
Yeah. So we have a picture of Harry Potter and Brigham Young. So many similarities.
Oh, well, and actually he implemented the oath of vengeance in the temple ceremony against the United States. And this lasted through to 1912. So, the idea that you would curse somebody and even curse them in the temple, this has, precedent.
Yep, it absolutely does. That's funny. I never thought about the oath of vengeance, but you're right. That covers everybody and everything, right? So, all right, let's dig into some of these stories then, what we're going to talk about. So, okay, why don't you read this? Ganesh, it kind of talks about the curse of the martyrdom.
The pharaohs of ancient Egypt were said to have mystic powers that surrounded them after death. When King Tut's tomb was discovered in the early 1900s, there was a curse that surrounded the tomb and brought death unto all who entered the tomb. So it was with Joseph Smith. A curse followed members of the mob that murdered Smith and his brother Hyrum. Many witnesses swear that they saw and heard what is true concerning the suffering of the mobocrats that participated in the murder of Smith and his brother Hyrum. Gruesome accounts of mob members supposedly becoming marked men by a god who was gunning for them eventually appeared in a sensational book compiled by N.B. Lundwell entitled The Fate of the Persecutors of the Prophet Joseph Smith.
That's right. And that's the book that we're going to be talking about today. Have you guys read that book or heard of that book? So many people have told me, oh, I have that in my bookshelf, or my grandparents have that on their bookshelf. This was a wildly popular book, I think, because it was so gruesome. It was one of the few church books that teenage boys would read, right?
Well, I've certainly heard of it because it's
if we go to the next slide, we will.
Ours,
that name sounds familiar, doesn't it? N.B. Lundwall. Who else do we know with the name Lundwall? Believe it or not, this book was written by Dr. John Lundwall's grandfather. And this is how Landon and I even connected with Dr. John in the first place, because we talked about this book on Steve Pineker's Mormon Book Reviews with Maven. And when we posted the episode, John anonymously, we didn't know who he was, reached out and said, that's my grandfather. And we just started chatting, and, our collaboration and relationship started from there. So I think it's just, his grandfather was a great compiler. He would compile all kinds of things, books about visions, in this case, books about the folk stories about the fate of the persecutors of the prophet Joseph Smith. But this book was taken as gospel truth for decades. Like, people really believed this. So it says in 1952, the book entitled The Fate of the Persecutors of the Prophet Joseph Smith, that's a mouthful of a title, was published by N.B. Lundwall, grandfather of our own Dr. John. Within its pages, among other things, Lundwall presented various stories describing how many of those who played significant roles in the persecution of Joseph Smith met with unfortunate ends in unnatural and sometimes gruesome ways, underscoring the idea of, as Ganesh pointed out, divine justice and retribution. Yep, that's it. They're going to get theirs. In this case, on earth, though. Their crime was so heinous, they had to suffer in the flesh. Yep, that was it. All right.
And I think it's important. It's like you said, N.B. Lundwall did not make up these stories. He did not create these stories. He did not research them for accuracy. What he did was he compiled the stories that were floating around and put them into a book to preserve those narratives and the stories that were being told about the persecutors of Joseph Smith. This is not based on any research or anything like that. It's the stories that were going around, and he took them, compiled them, and put them in a book.
Yeah, and he did interview some people. I learned he collected stories, that had been written down, accounts in journals, things like that. And then he also interviewed people who had heard the story from, grandfather or something. So he was pretty thorough. And we'll get later on in the podcast into the truth of some of these stories, but it sure is kind of fun to go through these stories. And, definitely around Halloween time, this is it. So this is one of the most terrifying stories. And this story that we're going to tell here, the person is actually buried in Utah. And Landon and I were going to show some pictures later. We took a field trip to his grave. That's right. This is going to be very spooky. But let's go through the story of Old Man Brooks. Poor Old Man Brooks. Do you want to read the beginning of the story, Landon?
Yeah, about the year 1892, when I was 18 years of age, an old man by the name of Brooks moved into our neighborhood. The old man used to come to my father's home, sit on the porch, and talk to my father about Joseph Smith the prophet. On one particular evening, after my father had talked about Joseph Smith, the old man said, "I saw the last bullet shot onto the old boy." After Mr. Brooks had gone to his cabin, my father said, "No wonder he is a miserable old soul. If he saw the last bullet shot into Joseph Smith, he was in that mob. If he was in that mob, it had been prophesied that he will suffer all kinds of torment. His limbs shall rot off of his body, and he will not have the courage to take his own life." After this conversation, I took particular notice of the old man and how he suffered. The old man had a belt which he wore around his waist, which the son would take off, then beat the old man with it just to hear him scream. And when beating him, the son would laugh and profane and seem to enjoy it. All of this I saw.
And I forgot to include this gentleman's name, whose journal this came from. I'll have to make sure I put it in the chat. But this is a picture of the young man who was 18 that heard this, and then the father that was talking to Old Man Brooks. But again, what they're trying to say is that this Brooks from the mob moved all the way to Utah so he could undergo all of these terrible trials and tribulations in front of the saints so that they could see. And that's a common thread of all these stories. Everyone in the mob apparently moved to Utah so they could die these gruesome deaths in front of the saints. So, but this is a journal entry, toward the end of the 19th century. So, all right, let's find out more about poor Old Man Brooks. This really is a gruesome tale. Do you want to read this part, Ganesh?
The old man was crippled and could walk with only the aid of two sticks, one in each hand. Without the aid of these, he was totally helpless and unable to walk. The cause of this crippled condition was unknown to me. The sun would drive the old man up the coal mine dump about 300 yards from their cabin, like he would drive cattle, and fill sacks with coal, tie the sacks on the old man's back, and drive him back to the cabin. The old man would beg his son not to fill the sacks too full of coal. If he would not go fast enough, the son would whip him with his belt, which he has taken from the father before going for the coal.
Oh, what a miserable existence. He's elder abuse, his son, all of this. Poor old Brooks. All right. What else happened to him? All right. They then moved to Coleville, and while living there, his toes rotted off his feet. This is a theme in all these stories, a lot of rotting flesh. Later, a Dr. Cannon, who owned a ranch in Weber Canyon, made arrangements with this old man and his son to start a chicken ranch on Dr. Cannon's premises, on to which the father and son moved. About that time, and I have pictures of this. This is what's crazy. About that time, my sister Elizabeth Chappell married Thomas Wild, and he owned a ranch adjoining Dr. Cannon's and lived about 400 yards from where the old man and his son lived. So this is the sister and her family that lived next to Old Man Brooks. Dr. Cannon made inquiry concerning the disappearance of the chickens on the farm, and the old man replied that the skunks had eaten them up. To which Dr. Cannon replied, "You are the biggest skunk." So he was hated and reviled in the community. Nobody liked him. Everybody knew who he was and what he had done, to the point where they called him a skunk.
He was stealing the chickens.
Yeah, stealing the chickens, and his toes had rotted off, and he was being beaten by a belt. It's just, but again, the Lord will have his vengeance, right? So the saints probably have to just nod their head. All right, what else happened to poor old Brooks? Okay, go ahead, Landon.
The son would often leave his father for 3 or 4 days and sometimes a week without food. I was up to my brother-in-law's ranch one fall in November when an 8-inch snow fell, the weather clearing up in the afternoon and dropping to zero weather by night. My brother-in-law and I took over an extra quilt and some supper to the old man and also chopped wood, which we piled close to the stove so that he could handily keep the fire going during the night without getting out of bed. After returning home later in the night, I heard him screaming. I awoke my brother-in-law and he said, "Don't take notice of him. He always screams like that." When we got up the next morning, we looked towards the cabin and saw that the house was gone. We immediately went to where his cabin had been and found it had burned to the ground during the night. All the old man's clothes had burned off of him, and he was burned all over his body from his feet to the top of his head. He was alive and lay curled up in ashes of the burned cabin, trying to keep warm.
I mean, that is so gruesome. And again, these are journal entries of supposedly pioneers at the time that knew this was happening in their area. So very gruesome. All right. Can it get worse? Let's find out. All right. Go ahead, Ganesh, your turn.
We secured some quilts, and with our team and sleigh, we took him to Peoria, where we found the son. The people of Peoria took up a collection which amounted to $5, gave it to the son, and told him to go to Park City for the particular medicine he was directed to buy. With the money, the son bought liquor and became drunk and did not return for 4 days. Old man died on the 4th day after he was burned before his son returned. The son was ordered out of the county and he left immediately for parts unknown.
And there it is. And it was William H. Chappell who wrote this entire account. And you can find this in the book we talked about and also other places. So the son just left, no medicine, got drunk, and poor old Brooks died. So now I think I have some pictures of our field trip. I think that's coming up next. Is that not quite? Okay. So, and here's another affidavit. And like I said, N.B. Lundwall really gathered these things where people had signed, that they had experienced this. So this person says, I, Joseph H. Wilde, was present when my brother, Thomas Wilde, and others took the blankets to the cabin to cover the old man, as stated in the above affidavit. The old man was a habitual user of chewing tobacco, and upon this occasion, my brother had purchased a plug for him and presented it to him. The old man thought it was a revolver that was being shoved toward him, and he exclaimed, "For God's sake, don't shoot me. I was a little boy when these things happened, but I can distinctly remember the old man referring to the prophet Joseph Smith as Old Joe Smith." And that was quite the slur to refer to him like that. Although this man was implicated in the murder of the prophet Joseph, yet the Latter-day Saints who resided in this vicinity were very considerate and brought food and clothing to him. Particularly was this true of my brother Thomas Wilde, who resided but a short distance from the cabin in which the old man Mr. Brooks lived. His son Alf Brooks helped my brother during the haying season and ate dinner at his home, were they so employed. And this is signed by Joseph H. Wilde. Signature was witnessed by Mrs. Joseph H. Wilde and N.B. Lundwall. So here's a case where he actually went and talked to these people. But again, a part of most of these stories is that despite the fact that these people had killed the prophet Joseph Smith, the saints are kind, the saints are loving, the saints are forgiving, and try to do all they can as they're rotting away to give them comfort in their last days. So, and that's part of this type of story. You have divine retribution. The saints aren't doing it. They can't help what God is going to do to these men, and they're going to show pity and concern. So you just see this over and over in the stories. It's really interesting.
It's very Mormon. Be kind while judging them for their faults.
That's it.
It's kill them with kindness.
Kill them with kindness. Yeah, chewing tobacco, whiskey. Old Joe Smith, all that stuff. He's a very objectionable character, and the fine upstanding saints are bringing blankets and help and everything. But the God is going to exact his vengeance on this.
And it says, although the man was implicated in the murder, I'm not sure what that means. Implicated by who?
Himself. The only evidence is that he himself told everybody.
Yeah.
And there's also this thought that, it kind of makes you sound, I was there. You know what I mean? for whatever reason to kind of give yourself some self-importance or something, because I seriously doubt, and I guess we could check records, that anybody moved from Nauvoo, unless they came with the saints, which I also seriously doubt. So
I think too, some of these stories, I mean, it was hard in the frontier of Utah.
Yeah.
And actually, gosh, some incredibly terrible situations.
Yes.
And so instead of saying this person is in a horrible situation, it's easier, and we still do it today, right? They must have done something to bring this on themselves.
Yes.
This kind of level of deprivation can only be because in the background there's some unresolved sin that is stopping them from progressing and feeling blessed by God. So we still use curses, so to speak, or doing the idea that people have these background sins to explain why some people are having a horrific experience.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It really is a form of prosperity gospel. It's the opposite of prosperity gospel, right? You're doing something right. God's going to bless you. There's something terrible in your past. Sorry, we're going to try to be nice, but you're not right with God, and He's going to make you rot from the inside out. So no, that's a really good point. That exists today. And we loved kind of to hear those kinds of stories. It's kind of, you get all shivery. You're like, ooh, that would never happen to me, but look what happened to them, right? Which is why I think this book was so appealing, had so much appeal over the years.
And you're right. It sets a narrative. We're chopping wood, we're bringing blankets, we're watching out. Where's his son? He's drinking. We brought him tobacco. He's being whipped. He's beating him with it. All of these things. It's
low lives.
It's just a juxtaposition of, here are the saints doing these marvelous things, and here's the persecutors, and they're these horrible, low down creatures.
Low down, dirty, rotten.
Scoundrels.
Exactly. All right.
It's also very passive aggressive, which we're very good at, right? The idea of I'm going to do good despite their
that's right.
Their wickedness.
That is such a good point. I know you can tell some people don't want to be doing what they're doing, but they'll do it because they're nice, right? They're kind, but not really. Exactly. So Peoa. This is very close to where we are here in Utah. So after his burial in Peoa Cemetery, now this is where it gets spooky, a rock rolled down the hillside behind and stopped right on top of the grave, right? Divine intervention, sealing that grave with a giant rock. And it was just decided to leave it there as a marker. And then mysteriously, no one can quite figure out what happened, but supposedly a plaque is placed on it as a Boy Scout project to tell the story. So Landon and I knew the plaque was there, but it's still very nebulous where the plaque came from. But the rock is there with a plaque on it. So one day we're just like, you know what? This is only a couple hours away. Let's go figure out where this is. And I know that we had talked to Maven about a year ago about going on this trip, and it never worked out. So I think Maven was there with us in spirit because she had definitely wanted to come along. But I think the next pictures that we have are of the site. Yes. So Mormonish field trip to, is it Peoa? Am I saying
Peoa,
it right?
Yeah.
Peoa? I don't know where the
Peoa's up by, it's kind of between Park City and Heber in that area.
Yeah, so really not too far away, maybe like an hour. So we got in the Mormonish van and we headed up to Peoa. So we see if we can find that rock.
It's actually between Park City and Colville is where it's at. It's not towards Heber. So sorry about that.
So here it is. We found it. You can find online the coordinates is the Peoa City Cemetery. So we drive up there, and on the picture on the left, we're looking around. You see the headstones. And then right there, kind of in the center, we see a bush. And there's a rock, and we're like, could that be it? Right. And you can still see the hill up behind where supposedly that rock just God's hand kind of, kicked the rock off the hill and it smashed down on the grave. Ooh, I hope everybody's getting scared. So there it is. So it's right by that bush. We walked up to it. There it is. And it says, gosh, I don't know if Brooks, participant in the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith. And so there it is. It's a very mysterious plaque. Nobody really seems to know. And I read and researched a lot exactly where it came from, except for somebody said it was possibly an Eagle Scout project.
And do we know was Brooks his first name or his last name? I mean, we didn't even get a full name on there.
Nobody knows. And you know, there's a
I think
list.
His son wasn't his son in one of the stories here. Alfred.
Alfred.
So Brooks must be his last name.
Yeah. And had I had more time, I was going to go on Family Search and see if I could do the research. And maybe before we air this, I'll try again, because it should be pretty easy to figure out. You know, they live in Park City area. You know, they're up there in that county. It's you know, we don't know the father's name, but we know the son was Alfred Brooks. And then we could tie that back to, was there anybody in the mob? Because they have the list of a lot of them. I don't feel like that will happen, because I think we would have already seen that as research. But yeah, so there it is. Let's go to the next picture. I'm hoping some of you guys in Utah want to go do this. It's kind of cool just to see it. And so there we are. We're standing there. It was a little more in the summer when we went, standing by the rock and taking it all in with that hill in the background. And the rock must have really rolled. Don't you think, Landon? I didn't really think about that until I saw this, but I mean, it must have just been zooming down that hill to hit that grave.
It's a big rock.
And it's a big rock.
Tumbling down. Yeah.
Yep. And so funny, because it is kind of on a slope. The fact that the rock stopped right there. There is something about that. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that it has sealed this grave and made it so that Brooks, as a zombie, could not escape and terrorize the local communities.
Exactly, with his burning, charred body, because it has that sense like a vampire. You know, we're going to seal it into the crypt. It's just done, and God has said you're over. So, and I think the last picture is the hill.
No resurrection for him.
Exactly, no resurrection. Yep, there it is, kind of the angle of the rock would have had to, I mean, it would have had to start up pretty high to get that momentum and then get down there.
Yeah.
And then land right there. Yeah. And I don't know, that wall I think is probably more recent, and that's my AI drawing of poor old Brooks. Looks kind of sad. So anyway, this is one of the more famous stories that actually has physical evidence there in Peoa, that anybody can go to that cemetery and, you know, gather there at Halloween. I don't know. No, I'm not saying to do that. But anyway, we just thought that was really fascinating. And then I thought, well, you know what, let's do a podcast about this after we visited. And as I said, but wait, there's more suffering, right? There's more suffering. So let's go through a couple more of these. You'll just start to see the pattern. It's so interesting. Landon, do you want to read this one?
But wait, there's more suffering. Another devout Mormon laid out in stark and hard detail the supposed horrible fate prepared for yet another hapless prophet-murdering mob member. One man, a Jack Reed, an old man who was respected in the valley, said that he was a member of the mob who martyred the prophet. He was about 15 years old at the time. He said he took his gun and marched proudly to Carthage and took part in the killing of the two prophets. About the last of September, I heard that Jack Reed was very sick of a strange ailment. He was taken ill in a few days after having made the statement that he took part in the affair at Carthage. But no one had told me of his sickness until I heard it from one of my Indian friends who said he had worms in his flesh. I determined to see him if I could and tried to get him to verify the statement he had made. The man had no family. I asked if Miss Whitmore and myself would be allowed to visit Mr. Reed. I was told that Mr. Reed was a sight that no white woman would be allowed to look upon.
Ooh, if that doesn't make you shiver and wonder what's going on, that's what I mean. These stories, they just have this element of horror, which is why they are exciting to repeat. People love stories like this. All right, let's find out what else happened. Okay, there you go. Ooh, you get to read the good part, Ganesh. Here you go.
He was literally eaten alive by worms. His eyeballs had fallen out, the flesh on his cheeks and neck had fallen off. And although he could breathe, he could take nourishment only through an opening in his throat. And I was told that pieces of flesh as large as my two hands had fallen off from different parts of his body. The sick man's farm was given to the white men who attended him and his first of his ailment. Finally, when they could no longer endure the ordeal, the Indians were called in to pour water into his throat and give him whatever other attention they could, and these received the sick man's bunch of horses for their pay. When he finally passed, the Indians carried out the awful remains by the four corners of the blanket upon which he had lain for weeks and lowered that into a box the white men had prepared. The blanket was tucked in over him and the box quickly nailed up and put in a deep grave as soon as possible. No funeral was held.
See? Oh my goodness. Yeah. And this is a theme, the rotting flesh falling off your body. This is a theme in almost every story. And I'm thinking, okay, leprosy or, you just don't hear this in other places that you have this. So I don't know. What do you think about this story, Landon?
It's kind of funny. They, the white men can't handle it. The priesthood couldn't handle it. So they called in the Native
Americans,
and treat him because he was in such awful condition.
Yep.
Too gruesome for the civilized.
Yeah.
That is it in a nutshell, Ganesh. Too gruesome for the civilized. That's exactly right. So I think, is there any more to the story? Let's look at nope, that was it. Okay. So again, these stories, you're just going to see the same theme over and over. And it's so interesting because I question, okay, if I had participated in the martyrdom and I, for some reason, had moved to where the saints live, would I announce to everybody, and what good would it do me? And what would be my motivation that I had been in the mob? I mean, those rumors, think about Mountain Meadows Massacre. That was one of the reasons, given. There were rumors that the guns that killed Joseph Smith or members of the mob were in that party. The saints were still, really, really upset about this. So I don't know why these people suddenly would announce it. I don't know. So here's another.
They probably said something, they probably were in Utah feeling terrible and almost blaming Joseph that he had designated this place as being so they may have, cursed Joe Smith for, this, for bringing them to this God-forsaken place, and then of course, that was a mark of their disbelief or their dissenting ideas, and suddenly they were labeled as participant in these murders, therefore they deserved everything that came to them.
No, and I think that's true. And there is a human nature makes you want to be part of some event, whatever it is, or sound more exciting. I was there. A lot of us will do that. I can't tell you how many people say my great-great-great-grandfather was a bodyguard to Joseph Smith. Every person I know says that. Everyone says that. They want to, have, I'm sure some were, but not everyone. They want to have some touch in it, that dangerous frontier experience, that protecting the prophet. Everybody says that. Everybody's related to some famous person in church history. And, I guess you get some kind of satisfaction with tying yourself to those events, even if it's something that's something like the mob, because how do you trace that back then? So here's one called Jack Longstreet became Reed's first attendant in company. And that's the man that has just died. To these men, Reed confessed that his participation in the murder of the prophets was the cause of his affliction. So he admitted it. Woe unto me, right? It's because I killed Joseph. He said to Longstreet, "It is the Mormon curse that is upon me. I cannot live. I must utterly rot before I die." So he recognized that he deserved this divine retribution. He knew he'd brought it on himself, and he knew that he had to rot. He said that Brigham Young had pronounced the curse upon all the mob, that he had known 13 of them to die just as he was dying. 13, yep. But he had lived so long and had passed the unlucky number 13 that he thought to escape the curse, he charged his attendants to never do anything against the Mormons, to be their friends, or said he, "You may suffer the Mormon curse." Longstreet related this confession of Reed's as a warning and declared that he himself would not dare to raise a hand against them. And I don't think he ever did. So here's this other great element, right? Leave the Mormons alone, because the Mormons are in this precarious situation where they're very afraid of any outside influence coming in and again running them off or persecution. So your flesh might rot off your body if you touch us, So the stories also serve as a cautionary tale, a warning, maybe a protection, sort of a thing. Interesting, huh? How folk stories, folk tales work that way.
It also stands as a testimony that Oh,
Good point.
these were true prophets of God.
Yeah.
And that's why this curse works, is because these are true men of God, and we're testifying of their power and authority because we killed them, and this is the result, and we can't deny it. So it's their testimony of these leaders.
I can't deny it, and my skin's falling off. That's all part of it. So. All right, who else do we have?
The maggots have spoken.
The maggots have spoken. That's right. They hold a lot of weight there. Oh, goodness. Boy, I had a lot of fun with AI. That's why we're releasing this right around Halloween time. Woo! So, okay, Landon, what about this one?
According to the claims in the book by a devout Mormon who supposedly encountered a doomed mob member who had participated in the killings of Joseph and Hyrum Smith, the murderer was visited with horrific physical afflictions. I noticed that the lower part of one ear was gone, a part of the left side of his nose had rotted away, and there were other repulsive sores on his face. He showed me his hands. There was very little solid flesh on them. I expressed my sympathy for him, and he said his feet were worse than his hands. I asked him what had caused all this trouble, and he replied, "I don't know, unless it was a curse God had placed upon me." He said some men had told him that was it because he was with the men who killed Joe Smith, the Mormon prophet. I guess that was the main reason I drifted out here. I wanted to know how the Mormons made out without Joe Smith to lead them.
That's it. Of course.
He's so curious that he makes a 2,000-mile journey just to find out anything he could have read in a newspaper.
Yeah. Well, he couldn't because they burned down the press. So he could not have read it. What do you think, Ganesh? This just has all the elements of a folk story, right? And serves all the purposes of a folk story.
Yeah. Oh gosh, and we love our ghost stories, don't we? You know, because they give us that sense of danger and that we've escaped, but also that, you know, as you've rightly pointed out, you know, that the wicked, those people who have persecuted us, have got their comeuppance. They've got their reward for their dastardly deeds, and so you can be confirmed in your righteousness, and you can be equally have this testimony of their divine retribution. You know, so it's just it's a beautiful way that we console ourselves in our particular narrative.
Yeah, it is. And it's why they're so attractive. It's why that book was so popular. It's why these stories continue to be told. It's just human nature to be attracted to this kind of a story with these kinds of elements. So, especially for teenage boys, right? All right. Who else do we have? Oh, my goodness. No end to these stories. Oh, okay. Let's have Ganesh read this. This is from the autobiography of Parley P. Pratt.
On some of those involved in the murder, the curse began working immediately. From the autobiography of Parley P. Pratt, we learned that an Iowan man named Townsend had participated in the martyrdom. A shot from Joseph Smith's pistol wounded him in the arm. Soon the arm began to rot, was finally amputated. This is from Paulson's Fate of the Persecutors. However, the operation did not stop the strange rotting, and 8 or 9 months after the operation, Townsend died, having literally rotted alive. Before dying, Townsend confessed that he knew Joseph Smith was a prophet.
There it is. There it is.
These testimonies, I think we should, you know, gosh, they need to be heard over the pulpit. I don't think that we'll...
Because Joseph Smith shot me in the arm and it rotted away, I know he's a prophet of God.
With my last dying, rotted breath. Exactly. But, you know, I'm surprised that we haven't heard some of these stories. I have not heard these stories over the pulpit because I'm guessing somewhere, and maybe in the chat you guys can tell me, I'm guessing these are shared. I'm guessing they are because they have all those elements that, like you said, testimony building and retribution and prosperity gospel. They have everything.
I see a new movie from Angel Studios on its way out.
Well, these stories are as real as the new movie 6 Days in August about the succession crisis. just as real. Yikes.
Just as real. And if Joseph Smith had been spared, we would have talked about angels, delivering him and all those kinds of things. But because he wasn't, we have to do the opposite and suggest that the curses from these murderers are the testimony of the truthfulness. So it's interesting how, when an event goes one way, it's framed in a particular, mystic, miraculous way, and when it goes another way, it's framed in, a different but equally powerful, mystic, mysterious, magical, angelic, or demon way to describe what's going on.
Yeah, no, that is such a great point. Either way, the listener, the hearer of the story, gets their satisfaction that there is something in the other world that is watching out for them, whether by smiting down somebody that did wrong, or if the person, survived, it was an angel intervention. Somebody is looking out for you. Jesus has the wheel somewhere. So I love
Heads
that.
I win, tails you lose.
Yep, that's it. Heads I win, tails you lose. That's it. Okay. Who else do we have? All right. Okay. Such deaths were not meted exclusively to those who murdered Joseph Smith. Many men who either persecuted the Mormons, so it's not just members of the mob. This can also be people who persecuted Mormons in the East and Midwest, or who tormented Mormon missionaries, met similar fates. And that's the same function to these stories. Some were killed in bizarre falls, gored by rams, buried alive, or horribly crippled. Others froze to death, died of drunkenness, or were shot. It sounds to me like just, these are more realistic. These are things that happen in a frontier life of a certain era. But of course, then you can spin them and say, he was persecuting the missionaries, or he wasn't kind to the Mormons here. And so you're always, it's opposite of prosperity gospel. You're always looking for a reason something terrible happens. And if you can attribute it to somebody persecuting, your group, then you feel much better. You feel warm and fuzzy inside, right? Even though you go, oh, dear, but you're like,
And in frontier Utah, with Brigham Young trying to keep some semblance of order, there were people defecting all over the place. They had come from the East where it was lush, and they ended up in this desert where they're starving. There were a lot of people who took off, and the narrative that there was some hell awaiting those who would reject the commandments and the prophets, like even Brigham Young. This was reinforced by being met by the Indians along the way, and and there are a number of gruesome things that happened to people who strayed from the faith. So these ghost stories, the underlying premises, of course, do what you're required to do, or else these fates are yours. They're a warning.
And it's really no different. It's really no different than what we experience today. These are just the things that happen in their lifetime. Someone's horribly crippled. You're always worried about that, and that, well, then follow the prophet. Don't stray.
Yeah.
We have the same thing. Oh, if I don't pay my tithing, I'm going to lose my job, and I'm going to get cancer, and you just start thinking of all these horrible things that are going to happen to you if you don't do exactly what you were told to. And it's encouraged. You sit in general conference and you hear stories of how someone didn't pay their tithing and something horrible happened to them, or someone did pay their tithing and, everything turned out just perfect.
Yeah.
And so these stories are human nature, and they're how you try to convince somebody to believe something they wouldn't otherwise believe.
No, it's an archetypal story. I mean, like you said, it's human nature. Fairy tales were so gruesome to begin with, right? Older, hundreds of years ago. And people wonder why. They're very watered down now. It's this exact reason. They're morality tales. They explain to you kind of the structure of your civilization and your life, and, the good versus the evil. Keep yourself in line. They serve a real purpose. So there's a reason that we're so attracted to these kind of stories. Okay, let's see. Hopefully we're getting to the end of the death and mayhem soon. Oh, here you go, Landon. What about this one?
The statement of Seth Howe had a lasting impression on me as he related, "My grandfather was one of the leaders of the mob which murdered Joe Smith." I questioned him further as to what became of his grandfather afterwards. He related that following the assassination of Joseph Smith, his grandfather never saw a well day, although he lived for several years afterwards. His condition grew progressively worse, and physicians of the day who called to attend him were unable to diagnose it as any known affliction, but his suffering was so intense that he frequently expressed the desire to obtain poison to end it all. His family very carefully kept anything out of that nature out of his reach, and at his final demise, he actually had rotted alive, finally dying in intense agony.
There's the rotting again.
A lot of rotting going on.
There's so much rotting, and that's we'll find out in a little bit. There is a historical precedence for that, but yeah, I guess that's probably the worst thing they could think of, right? To rot from the inside out, because it's so unexplainable, and you can't.
Well, when you think about the imagery, the guy was so rotten inside that it came out and consumed him.
It's a metaphor. You're absolutely right. That's a very good way to look at it. Yeah. All right. Okay. I think, and there were more stories. If you want to read more about the maggots and the rotting flesh, get N.B. Lundwall's book. You can still get it on Amazon and have a good Halloween scare out of it. But the more interesting story, of course, is what really happened. What's the real story? And of course, we do know that because, as Ganesh pointed out, everything is very well documented. So unfortunately, the historical credibility of most of these stories is seriously lacking since they are based on unverifiable hearsay rather than well-documented and corroborated records. These morbid tales are thus the stuff of legend and folklore rather than a robust documentary record. And I think we probably all guessed that. So, Landon, do you want to read this?
Those who were responsible for the death of the prophet Joseph Smith and his brother Hyrum on June 27, 1844, were not who might you think they were, according to one presenter at BYU Studies' 50th Anniversary Symposium. Deborah Marsh, a master's student at the University of Utah, presented evidence Friday that the members of the Illinois mob that sought to put an end to Mormonism at Carthage Jail didn't rot away because of the Mormon curse, as N.B. Lundwall claimed in his book, The Fate of the Persecutors of the Joseph Smith, but went on to live normal lives.
But that's not acceptable. That doesn't fit your narrative. That doesn't fit with divine retribution. We can't have that, right? That just doesn't work.
Absolutely. You're not going to dissuade people from killing more of these prophets if you don't tell them there's a curse associated with it.
That's probably true. All right, let's find out what really did happen. Here we go. All right. Why don't you read this, Ganesh?
Another characterization from B.H. Roberts found in the introduction to Volume 6 of the History of the Church, which called the mob a criminal element and ruffians, isn't correct either. Marsh said in her paper, Respectable Assassins, a collective biography and socio-economic study of the Carthage mob, said that contrary to popular belief, the mobsters did not suffer for the actions and actually were respected people who went on to greater accomplishments. The Carthage mob members lived normal lifespans through which they prospered financially, Marsh said. They ran for and won political office and generally appeared to be protected and honored by their fellow citizens for their participation in the murders of Joseph and Hyrum.
That's very different from the stories that we just read, isn't it?
I'm sensing a pattern here.
Yeah. But again, that doesn't fit the narrative of divine retribution. You can't kill the prophet and then go on to have a normal life as a respected citizen and actually prosper. That's not how prosperity gospel works or any of this. So, but unfortunately, the facts are out now. So Marsh used a list of 89 men compiled by Sheriff Jacob Blackenstos and a variety of other records to paint a picture of who the mobsters were. According to her research, while they came from the same regions of the country as others who lived in the area, the mobsters, kind of in quotes, were generally older than the general male population of Hancock County and were mostly learned professionals, businessmen, and farmers who had their own property. The mob also had 16 men who held 24 different public offices, including state senator and U.S. senator. a large majority of the mob would have been considered as the upper class, not dressed like Landon right now, right? Hold up your bottle, right? You're
right. They weren't drinking the
not
hard
like
Welch's
that. That's
sparkling
right.
cider.
Yeah, sparkling. Is it sparkling cider, Landon? I don't know. It takes a lot to get through these Mormonish episodes. So this was a group of men that represented the top tier of Hancock County in regards to power and socioeconomic status. Wouldn't it be interesting if that was the narrative that we learned at church or in primary when they said, hey, kids, so the top tier people in the county got together and decided that they needed, very different narrative, just does not track with what we need it to be.
And it makes sense because these Mormons were threatening the socioeconomic of the area of what the county would look like. You have a respectable county, and all of a sudden you've got this group moves in and starts practicing plural spiritual wivery and different things like this. It's like that documentary Wild Wild Country, where you just have people sitting there living their lives in a remote city, and all of a sudden here come all of these they were basically hippies that took
Rashnishi. If you guys haven't seen this, it's on Netflix. It's called Wild Wild Country, and it's exactly this, where a group, sort of a cult from India, comes in with very different morals, and they have the money, the land, and they take over a small town. And you see what the citizens, of course, they can't do what happened hundreds of years ago, but most of them end up moving away. But it's a very good representation of what it must have been like.
Yep.
I should interject here to suggest that because it was an Indian cult, that everybody was exceptionally good looking.
They were actually, I mean, it was a sex cult.
Ganesh is part of the Indian mob, right?
That's right. That's it. No, I mean, it was exactly that. And if you think about the morals of the day and just terrified, that their wives, their daughters, might somehow be impacted. I'm telling you, there's a moment in my life where I realized I would have been the mob. I would have tried to protect my family from this, And after that, you see things in a different way and you can't unsee it, Very interesting. So anyway, top tier of Hancock County. That's what we're talking about. All right, let's read some more about these guys here.
It's so fascinating. And I think you're so right, Rebecca. That word mob, we just have that image that it gives to us the idea that these people are evil, but when we think of, the most respected people of the community, that's not a trail. We if you said that the most respected people of the community killed Joseph Smith, then it would automatically have lots of questions associated with it. Why did they do that? Why didn't they let it go through the court system? Why would they risk their lives to hurt somebody else? There's just lots of questions you start to ask, and the answers to those questions are not the answers that the church wants you to find.
Yep, very well said. It reminds me of Landon. Remember when a group of us went to see the play 1820? We saw it in Provo. It had been written by a BYU theater professor, and it was about, those early days of the church. And every time the mob would come on stage, you could just hear this, they sounded like drunken pirates. It was ridiculous. And they were holding their cigars. And I mean, it was just such a stereotype. It was ridiculous, had nothing to do with reality, but it does have to do with the reality that all of us grew up with. It was just this mindless, faceless group of people with their sparkling cider bottles and their cigar, they're breaking every Mormon rule, right? And they all talk like pirates somehow, but because like you said, Ganesh, the truth is much more problematic, much more disturbing to our narrative that we grew up with.
You have to ask yourself, if these men held 24 different public offices, including state senator and U.S. senator, these guys could have had a jury, they could have had trials, they could have found him guilty. These are the men who controlled the legislature, the courts, the other things. So why didn't they? Why didn't they just use their power over the courts to bring him to justice rather than do this? Again, I think the answer is that they knew that there was this large army sitting right off, and they were frightened by that. That if they had convicted Joseph and put him in jail, that army would come and free him. And so this was the easiest way. But you've got to ask the question: why do the people in power fear him so much? Is it because the gospel's true, or is it because he's got an army, which is why he was basically in for treason, was because of he was not afraid to use that violence against the people around him, and they'd seen that in Missouri, and now they're afraid it's going to happen here in Illinois.
Such a good point. There's a reason it was called the Mormon problem back in Washington. There's a reason that they talked about it constantly in all of their legislative meetings, the Mormon problem. It was an issue to the security and the stability of the entire United States. People don't realize this. It was a big issue, the Mormon problem.
Joseph had brought the state of Illinois to the brink of civil war. Mm-hmm. That's how terrible the previous few days before he died, how bad things had come to. Governor Ford was really, just walking a tightrope between things descending into chaos and, there being law and order. And this is what Joseph had brought the state to. We talk about Missouri being this terrible place where, the Mormons were expelled and, exterminated. The idea that this was, this is kind of how bad things could be for the saints, but actually things were worse in Illinois, just because Joseph gave himself up, because he was held in jail. Actually, it didn't descend into a all-out war. It was just so close. Just a few little things that could have turned things completely different. So instead, we tell the story of a martyrdom. Instead, we tell a story of these curses, but it could have easily have been a completely different story.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I think on it, not to trivialize the martyrdom, but to on a micro level, towns where they're building temples, and suddenly 2,000 people all wearing the same color show up at a city meeting, and citizens go, what is this? What is this group? Are they influencing the vote? Fabrics of communities ripped apart with these differences, and people acting, as a block. You can see that, how it sort of, it affects the equilibrium of a town and a society when you have this. And we've seen this over and over in towns. So yeah, it's really interesting to look back at how it more than likely was, instead of what we were told. So, all right. Do any of okay, here we go. That's right. So Marsh, this researcher, then showed what happened to the mob after the martyrdom of the Smith brothers. Because, of course, as we learned, they all rotted to death. Not true. Most of these individuals seem to have lived normal lifespans in which they prospered, she said. Obviously, living a long life doesn't necessarily translate into good fortune. But if financial well-being is an indicator of the quality of one's life, then they lived quite well. In 1850, the average earnings of the mob were barely more than the U.S. average, with mobsters earning $1,540 compared to $1,050 for the average American. So the mobsters were living better than the average American, is what these findings are. But at the end of the decade, the mobsters had increased their earnings by 249%, or 5 times the national average, earning an average of $7,842 compared to $2,140. So they already were in a different class than the average American, but by the end of their lives, they were all very successful. And again, that does not match the narrative at all. We don't want to hear that. There has to be some kind of divine retribution for what they did.
And the prosperity gospel suggests that actually they were being blessed for their actions.
Exactly. That's why that doesn't fit. That's exactly right. Good things don't happen to bad people. We all know that. And if they do, they'll get theirs someday. or they're not really happy. Those are the only things that, can make your narrative work. So it's just so interesting to see this. So, okay. What happened next? I think it's Landon's. Okay, here we go, Landon. Oh, yeah. Let's talk about this member of the mob.
One member, Mark Aldrich, he was the guy that was tried, actually.
Yeah.
He was that first guy you showed.
Yep.
Was extremely successful in the California gold rush and later became a merchant in Tucson, Arizona, and his personal estate valued at $50,000. Another, Jacob C. Davis, ended up being a state senator and eventually a U.S. senator for Illinois. Mob members held 24 public offices between 1844 and 1856. Marsh also referred to various historical accounts in which men list being part of the proceedings at Carthage Jail as one of their life's greatest achievements.
That is extremely telling right there, because we all learned it was simply because they were against the church. They hated the church. They hated Mormons. They hated the prophet. You don't list that as one of your greatest achievements if that was your motivation. Now, protecting your town, protecting society around you, protecting the fabric of your state, perhaps the Constitution, by doing what you did, that's a greatest achievement. So I wonder if that was more their mindset. I think it's very telling.
Mm-hmm. The other part is that, when, Brigham Young increased polygamy after Joseph's death, and then, took a large portion of the saints through to Utah. But there were a number of Mormons, Latter-day Saints, who remained in the area around Nauvoo, and who actually lived lovely lives. Of course, Emma Smith lived there, Lucy Mack, the other Smith sisters, and a number of other saints who lived in the areas around this space. And they did not have a problem whatsoever. Once the polygamy element, the cartel element of Mormonism moved to Utah, actually everybody lived in peace.
I'd never thought of that, but you're right. There were no more issues. What changed? What was different? You're right. The mob mentality, the polygamy, everything going against the societal norms, that was gone. And you just had Christian people living Christian lives, and everybody left everybody alone. I'd never thought of that. Wow.
And so it begs the question, of course, is it the mobsters like Brigham, calling these people mobsters to defer? It's an interesting, if we went to talk to these people, and you can almost talk to them. They wrote stuff. Governor Ford did a history of the state of Illinois a couple of years later, and about the role that the Mormons played in his particular part of political office during this time. And, the kinds of things that he talks about, he really describes Joseph Smith as a mobster, and, Brigham Young as a mobster. So you get the understanding that these people felt like the Mormons were the mobsters, the people that they were trying to get rid of. And of course, the saints have framed them as the mobsters, because of what happened at Carthage.
I almost want to retitle this, "We Are the Mob."
But
you had that observation, Landon. You started watching a bunch of programs on Netflix, remember? And you made that correlation between what best describes the early saints.
Well, yeah, and you look at what happened, and the problems, as you said, they disappeared when the saints left Nauvoo. They disappeared in Illinois, but they show right back up wherever the saints go. They go to Utah, and we still have charges of counterfeiting, of making money that they coined their own coins that only had 85% of the gold in them that they should have had to pass off. We see Mountain Meadow Massacre. We see all kinds of problems with immigrants coming in and them rejecting the federal government. They go to war with the federal government, with Johnson's army, to overthrow the state, the presidential appointed new territorial governor. the same problems existed. They just moved. So where was the problem? Did the problem originate with the people there, or was the problem these people? And that's why we see when they go to Missouri, there's a problem. When they go to Illinois, there's problems. When they go to Utah, there's problems. Wherever they go, the problems seem to follow.
Yep, that's true. And what I was alluding to before when I said Landon watched a bunch of Netflix, he started watching Narcos. And he said to me, I found what is the closest comparison that I can see to the early church. It's a cartel. It's run just like that with all the elements, or a mob, and I thought that was a really interesting observation, that you just had been watching, the dynamics on these programs and said, this is it. I see it now so clearly.
Yep, and you could see how a community that placed itself in a remote area where the top guys had control of everything in your community, everyone had to be beholden to them, just like in those those poor nations that are growing the cocaine and stuff. Those people really have no other choice. They're there and they have to do what the leaders say. That's their protection. But they're not leading them to a good
not conclusion. A good outcome.
Yeah, a good outcome. And that's the same thing we were seeing. So
yeah, hindsight is 2020, and that's for sure. All right, let's forge ahead here. I think we have a quote by, yes, this is a good one. Even the leadership kind of recognizes this, yet these stories are still told. Do you want to read this, Ganesh?
Yes, thanks. Even President Oakes debunked the nonsense spread by the fanatical Mormons that the killers of Joseph Smith were punished by vengeful Elohim with horrible deaths. A persistent Utah myth holds that some of the murderers of Joseph and Hyrum Smith met fittingly gruesome deaths, that Providence intervened to disperse the justice denied in Carthage Jail. But the 5 defendants who went to trial, including men who had been shown to be their leaders in the murder plot and other associated with them, enjoyed notably successful careers. The only principals involved in the Carthage trial who seemed to have been stalked by tragedy in their later careers were the prosecutors, the sheriff, the judge, and the governor.
And that is true. Isn't that interesting? But yeah, so even Dallin Oaks says, yeah, that's not really true. Yet these stories are still told. That's what's just so funny to me. They're told for a reason, I guess. They're important.
And we don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
That's right. It. That's exactly right. And that's kind of what we're going to end on. So if these are not true, why tell these tales? So in the years immediately following the martyrdom, Mormons were consistently on the defensive. It is then possible that the saints adapted the instances and consequences of legend in oral tradition, like those told by the Quakers of God retribution against the Puritans. And we did a Thanksgiving episode about this, where there were the Puritans were persecuting the Quakers to the extreme. I mean, murdered, all kinds of things. And the Quakers, of course, all they could say is, someday you'll get theirs. They had similar stories where people were dying gruesome deaths because they themselves were powerless to make anything happen. So it's similar to that. I think another religious group being persecuted only in their case, they truly were persecuted to their own particular circumstances or peculiar circumstance. As underdogs, which both of you mentioned, on the American frontier, the stories of the destruction of their enemies by a protecting God easily reinforced the belief that Mormons were the chosen, that the Creator would protect his children against the outrages of an unenlightened world, as he did Abraham, Moses, Job, and even the Puritans, that in the hour of darkness, the children could always look to the Father. And I think both of you guys kind of made that point. That's the purpose that it serves. We are protected. Even if we feel powerless, we're not. We have somebody behind us, that can make somebody rot away if they don't treat us right. So that's a big part of it. You want to read that, Landon, as we finish up?
In those early days after the martyrdom, the tales told of the killer's death may have had a practical value foreign to the minds of modern Mormons. They created and reinforced group solidarity in the face of real as well as imagined dangers. But this does not explain the popularity of such stories among faithful moderns. Mormons of the 20th century as a subculture are probably as conscious of the past, not necessarily the historical past, of their forebears as any other folk group in the United States. They look with pride to the blood and tears of handcart companies, to privations, winter suffering, persecutions by mobs and armies, because through all this the saints have endured. Besides their obvious appeal to the macabre and the sensational, the dark stories of suffering and death meted out upon the killers of the prophet affirm to a new generation of Mormons that the past is real, that the consequences of the martyrdom had effects and repercussions that the world still feels and will feel unto the third and fourth generation.
Yeah, that's exactly kind of what. Oh, go ahead, Landon.
We mentioned this to just today where we saw that movie, the 6 Days in August coming out, and we're like, how can they be so irresponsible? They know that these were not true affidavits. We know that we've got newspaper articles of there were two different newspapers writing about these sessions, and none of them make any mention of this. We have meeting minutes.
It's about the transfiguration.
About the transfiguration. And so we know that none of that happened. And yet here's a movie coming out to tell you all about the transfiguration. Why?
We haven't seen it, but this is what I understand it's about. So if you've seen it and it doesn't show that, let us know. We should go see it probably.
Yeah. I think we've got it on our list, but
I think it is.
The question is why? Exactly these reasons. It makes you feel that you have God on your side. God is watching over you. Miracles still happen in your culture, not in others, and people buy into that. And they know that not very many of these people are ever going to look into the actual history and actually dig and find out what really happened.
Very good point. Yeah, that's it. All right. I think we're almost to our very final slide. We're making it through here. All right. See, final thoughts and takeaways. There we go. We have a gruesome picture of the martyrdom, picture of Joseph Smith, and some of the poor people that rotted to death. So what's your take, Ganesh, on all of this? I think you expressed it very well throughout.
Well, it's very human, isn't it?
Yes.
This is something that we do to make ourselves feel better about the things that we are doing and to other people so that we can feel superior to them. A really good example, a modern example, is I'm currently in Dubai. I'm in the Middle East. I've just been in Saudi Arabia. But when I was in Utah a couple of months ago, my sister-in-law's mother, and I was telling her my plans, and I was going to visit my uncle here, and she was aghast. Oh no, I'd never go to the Middle East. I could never go there. Like she felt such danger for this place. And I'm trying to convince her that Dubai is one of the most futuristic cities in the world. It's beautiful. It's incredibly clean. It's amazingly safe. But she would have none of this because, of course, etched in her mind is this event of 9/11, which has cemented her understanding that, the Arab world, the Middle East, is an incredibly dangerous, terrorist-ridden place. And so, of course, going to these places is just beyond her ability to fathom that, good things can happen in these places. And, I literally outside my window is the tallest building in the world, the Burj Dubai, which is 800 meters high. When you come to lots of Muslim countries like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, even in Malaysia with Kuala Lumpur, these places have the most modern buildings, societies, infrastructure, technology. And then you go to China, and which is non-religious, and they have some of the best infrastructure, the tallest buildings, the most impressive cityscapes. You start to realize that there are other parts of the world which are dominating the economic prosper nation. So if your belief, and it's a big one, has been instilled in the idea of America, particularly being exceptional and being, amazing. And then you come to other places in the world which are from completely different cultures, completely different religious backgrounds, and they are doing extremely well. This damages that narrative. And so, of course, we take on board lots of things which are not true to keep ourselves, our privilege intact, to keep our superiority, enabled, and that's just the way that people live their lives, because we have to believe we're the heroes, otherwise we are the mob.
Couldn't have said it any better. That's exactly right. Yep. And our brains do this to us, right? It's how we work, trying to make us comfortable and safe in our narratives. Any final thoughts, Landon, with your hat? Can you see out from under that? I don't know if you can.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, if you're a church and you're trying to instill and breed this fear and this persecution mode, you can tell people that the people after you look like me, or you can tell them that they look like Rebecca. Which one is going to scare you?
I can be scary.
That's why they do it. Having someone that looks like you, as you said, you might be the mob. Today you could be the mob.
Yeah.
But no one wants to paint a picture of someone that looks like Rebecca as the mob.
Right, because then you have to say, what is someone doing to upset someone that seems like a normal,
that looks like a normal person?
Yeah, that makes you ask, what happened? What did they do? You don't have to ask that if someone dressed like Landon is the mob, because it's obvious. They just did it because that's what they do. Yeah,
that's what those type of people do. Yeah. And so that's why they have to paint it like that. So yeah, it's interesting to see, but now you know kind of the rest of the story.
Yeah, that's it. The rest of the story. So yeah, I think this was great, and like I said, we're going to air it near to Halloween, so it'll be very spooky. And I guess I just have one question left for each of you. You have to tell me what you're going to be for Halloween. Ganesh, what are you going to be for Halloween? You have a million costumes.
Well, being in the Northern Hemisphere, Halloween makes much more sense, than being in New Zealand. There are fall colors. There are pumpkins. I love pumpkin carving, and so I'll be trying to be as close to a pumpkin as possible for Halloween.
That's perfect. Landon, you can just wear that, I guess, although I feel like you'll terrify the trick-or-treaters if they come to the door. So
yeah, well, I'm going to be on an airplane somewhere between Hawaii and Japan, so I don't think I'll be wearing any costume. I'll be a weary traveler. How's that?
You guys are no fun. I'm going to be a witch like I always am. I'm going to be passing out the candy, carving the pumpkin. Halloween is my favorite holiday, so there it is. Everyone's doing the best they can. So, well, I hope you all enjoyed these horrific tales, and please comment. Let us know. Have you heard some of these stories? Have you heard these stories told by people who say it's the gospel truth, right? That's my favorite thing, when people say, I know this happened, I swear this happened, or have some kind of ancestor involved. People like to, it's like, I have a cousin's friend who told me, it's got to be true, has all the earmarks of that. So I'd love to hear you guys' take on it. And I hope there's been some really fun commenting back and forth in the chat, because I bet you guys have experience with this. So please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit the notification bell. If you'd like to donate and help financially support Mormonish Podcast, it is getting toward the end of the year, isn't it? I didn't even think about that. We all have to think about our donations, don't we? And we do have links in the show notes to Donor Box, and we absolutely appreciate each of you that do make a donation. It means all the difference to us, and we just appreciate you all so much. We also have links in the show notes to our Mormonish merch if you're interested in picking up any of that. And otherwise, I'll just say thank you, Ganesh, for working through the time difference. When we knew we were going to do something about rotting flesh and maggots, we're like, we got to get Ganesh. He's like the only one that's going to be able to keep up with us on this. So it was perfect.
It's been a lot of fun. Thanks very much.
Yeah, it's great. And thanks for sharing some of your, I wish we could see out your window. Can you move your camera at all? Maybe not.
Is it embedded? It's very hazy out there. So
is it? I was going to say, you don't even need a ring light. It looks so bright there, but we really appreciate you zooming in across the world to join us here on Mormonish. And thank you, Landon, for taking it seriously and dressing the part one more time with your bottle, so everybody gets the He's like, oh, you just
get Joe.
Oh my God. It looks so authentic on you. I don't even know what to do. All right, everybody. Too much fun and happy Halloween, everyone. We will see y'all next time on Mormonish. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.